What's good, everyone? I've had a busy November, but I appreciate you all tuning in for my review of Where Cards Fall. If you enjoy this type of content, please hit that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. It might not seem like much, but it really helps the channel grow and helps me create better content for you guys to watch. Now, let's get going. Movement was a much bigger issue in Where Cards Fall than it should have been. It seems like so much effort went into controlling cards that they completely forgot about the character. Even saying that isn't completely honest, as it's insanely frustrating trying to switch between decks. Character movement is limited to 4 directions as if it's a 2D dungeon crawler from the early 90s. When you find yourself on top of a house of cards, moving across the roof presents more issues and further slows the pace of the game. The camera is atrocious as well. I was prompted multiple times to rotate the Joy-Cons in order to view a level from a different angle, but it's extremely wonky and inaccurate. I was never able to rotate the camera more than a few degrees, and that made no difference when it came to solving the puzzle. In fact, it only made the game more annoying, as I'd often get my view obstructed by an irrelevant object just outside of the level. You are at least able to turn off the gyroscopic controls in the menu, but it doesn't make up for all the other issues I had with the controls. At least the game is playable, and as such deserving of a 1 out of 5. The mechanics, on the other hand, are adequate. The entire premise of the game is that you move around decks of cards in order to build houses of cards to be able to jump across platforms and progress to the next level. It's simple enough, but I don't recall any game ever trying this before. Aside from that, as you progress, the levels become more complex, adding wind that knocks away parts of the houses or new card types that form different structures once expanded. It all builds enough on the core gameplay to justify the length of the game, but doesn't do anything revolutionary to keep you interested till the end. 3 out of 5. Level design is deeply tied into the mechanics, and that's a good thing. Occasionally you will come across a level that feels much easier than it should, but in general, the levels become more difficult as you progress. They also add more of the different card types without solely focusing on one for a specific section of puzzles. Each level is designed as a single puzzle that needs to be solved in order to progress the story, but occasionally you'll get a level that's split into 2 puzzles. It's great level design, but it's not perfect, given that there is absolutely nothing else to do in any level except finish the puzzle and progress. 4 out of 5. Despite my qualms with the controls, the game runs amazingly well. In the 2 or so days where I put multiple hours into the game, I didn't run into a single obvious glitch. That being said, there were some weird moments while walking on roofs that I'm not really sure how to classify. Not much else to say about this metric. 4 out of 5. I found myself using the hint option towards the last third of the game. Although it was mostly mental, as in me not being able to fully focus on the game any longer, the puzzles did certainly get more difficult. There were a few where I genuinely needed to use the hint, otherwise I would have been stuck on the puzzle for hours. It begins pretty easy, but definitely takes a hardened gamer to complete the game. I'm not saying that's fair, but that's one way of getting the best out of how difficult the game actually is. 4 out of 5. I don't remember the last time a game looked so pretty with such garbage textures. Perhaps it was a stylistic choice, seeing as the world is largely made up of cards, but that doesn't explain why the non-card textures were all so flat. Every so often you play a level that's supposed to represent the character's psyche, and even the clouds in those levels look flat. There is no grain to any texture, and to further make this obvious, plenty of the interior areas from cutscenes have objects flatly drawn onto the walls. It's kind of egregious. You'll be sitting through a cutscene in your kitchen, and the microwave, stove, dishes are all just drawn onto a flat wall, having absolutely no volume. The only saving grace is that the flatness works perfectly for all the cards, and those cards play a major part in the game. But that doesn't justify why the rest of the world feels flat too. 2 out of 5. Despite the poor texture work, the overall art direction is appealing. The game feels designed to look like an indie game, with some minimalist design choices when it comes to the details on objects and the overall aesthetic. It's difficult for me to find a comparison visually, but perhaps that's also because it's not unique enough to be memorable. The developers knew what look they were going for and stuck with it till the end. and it works in their favor. 4 out of 5. The lighting really brings depth to all the environments in the game. It's quite subtle, with the light sources not being as obvious as in some other games, and that's fine. Rather than highlighting aspects of the environment, the light only sets the mood. It's dark when it's rainy, it's surreal in the dream levels, and it's bright for the happy moments in the character's life. The one place where lighting is an issue is during the many cutscenes where there's this dark aura around a giant pair of eyes watching the scene unfold. It breaks your immersion into the story and seems rather pointless. Still, this is just a minor issue, and the lighting is fitting of a 4 out of 5. There were just too few moments where I actually felt like I solved a difficult puzzle. The ones I experienced all happened throughout the first 2/3 of the game. This is mostly due to me losing interest and using hints towards the end just to beat the game, but that still contributes to a lower score here. Had I not lost interest in the story and gameplay, I may have found more things to pat myself on the back for doing. As such, I found myself playing this game more to finish the review than because I enjoyed it. 2 out of 5. Frustrating moments were limited to my issues with the story and loose controls. They weren't overwhelming, but by the end, I was so fed up with the game that I just walk away for a few hours after trying multiple times to jump off a roof and failing miserably. In the game, that is. Likewise, the story was frustrating because despite this being a puzzle game, the story is the reason you're trying to solve the puzzles, or at least it should be if it was more coherent. These are both issues that could have easily been solved with small tweaks, so I can't give this metric any better than the 2 out of 5. Perhaps my biggest complaint about Where Cards Fall is that you really can't tell. The story is a vague mess. All of the characters speak some unknown language consisting of melodic grunting that makes it near impossible to even decipher the emotion they are trying to convey. There's an ominous pair of giant eyes hiding in the shadows in most of the cutscenes. You're never led to think absolutely anything about them. You don't know what purpose they serve or who they represent. The game loops around without really telling a story. You start sitting on a bench in a park in the middle of winter, and you come back to that same spot multiple times before finally coming back there one last time at the end of the game, now with all the cards you've collected surrounding you. If this was meant to tell the story of the main character's life, then great, but it utterly fails to make any statement. It also fails in showing you that's what it's doing. You spend the entirety of the game in the early childhood, teenage, college, and young adult years of the protagonist's life, and then the game ends abruptly. The wintry spot you keep coming back to might suggest this person's actually dead, but if so, then did they die that young? How did they die? Why does the story focus so much on retelling the life of a character when seemingly the reason they're even reliving these memories is the focus, yet no light is shined on that? There's just a lot of safe choices that make this a bland narrative experience. There isn't anything bold being stated, and in fact, nothing at all being said about anything. The pacing doesn't help either, as it begins to rush throughout the protagonist's later years later in the game. The cutscenes could also be taken out and rearranged, and you'd have just as good of an understanding of what's going on. These life events could happen to anyone at any point in their lives, save for a few such as graduating college or struggling to find a decent job. That being said, I can't completely neglect the fact that there's cohesion in that these events could actually happen to a real person living an average life. 2 out of 5. The characters have much of the same flaws as the story. Not a single character is given a name, and not a single one is unique enough for you to be able to clearly follow them throughout the story. In fact, I even had trouble following myself throughout the game because of how average looking and bland the protagonist is. It's like putting 50 orange goldfish in an aquarium, watching them for a few hours, and then listing off what each individual one had done. The lack of expression and animation for each character greatly takes away from having you understand not only their motives, but simply what's going on in some of their interactions. There's little to no resolution to any relationship because you can't even tell what kind of relationship you have with any of the other characters. As you progress through the protagonist's early life, the other characters come in and out, despite you being led to believe they are important as nothing else is really going on in the story. There's plenty of characters to make the world feel alive, but so few clearly meaningful interactions that you can't help but feel that character design is severely lacking. 2 out of 5. The environments, while overall unique, feel empty. They are microcosms of events in the protagonist's life, isolated from each other. Sure, you'll see the occasional shadowy outline of an NPC, but you can't interact with them and they don't make the world feel any more real. There's also nothing to do in the world outside of solving the platforming puzzle to continue. I found myself on a few occasions trying to rearrange cards to reach what seemed like a secret ledger area, only to find that it was an awkwardly jutting out piece of the level. Some of the environments served a purpose, like when one of the puzzles had you dressed up as a construction worker building a skyscraper. This was right after a cutscene showing your architectural plans being approved for construction by the firm you work for. However, outside of a few instances like that, there was little purpose to the environments. Sometimes it rained, sometimes it was windy, sometimes you were in a forest, other times it was a sprawling cityscape. But the only rhyme or reason seemed to be to show off variety for the sake of variety. The dream levels looked and felt surreal like a dream, but unfortunately weren't able to convey any message aside from that. Given my mixed feelings about the environments, I think they do enough to get an average 3 out of 5. The music is also nothing to write home about. The song for the closing credits is great. It's an indie song I've never heard before, similar to the one used in the trailer for the game. Aside from that, there's nothing but ambient music throughout the actual game. It's like riding in an elevator. You don't mind it, but it doesn't catch your attention, and for a game, that's subpar considering how much of the experience it should be. 2 out of 5. Comparatively speaking, there are about as many discrepancies with how the world works in Where Cards Fall as there are in most larger scale or bigger budget games. Considering the scale, those games would be able to get away with these issues, but not Where Cards Fall. The most obvious inconsistency is the fact that you're able to jump across from House of Cards to House of Cards and also jump down to a lower level or floor, but somehow you are unable to climb or pull yourself up even an inch. This also applies to jumping across if you're jumping onto something that is even half a level lower than where you started. It makes no sense and is blatantly obvious since you can and often will experience this inconsistency on every level as it's woven into the main mechanic of the game. The fact that there's dream levels in the game also feels inconsistent when you consider that it seems like the entire game takes place in the memories of the protagonist. There's no explanation as to why the protagonist lives alone as a child. Perhaps the focus on those moments isn't on whom he's living with, but then why not at least include his family as a shadowy outline people that are present in nearly every level and cutscene, but not relevant to it. Each cutscene also gives no hint of there being some supernatural forces at work in this world or anything out of the ordinary happening for that matter, and yet there's an ominous pair of gigantic eyes watching what you do in some of the cutscenes. This many inconsistencies is unacceptable for an indie puzzle game. 0 out of 5. Usually, I would commend an indie game that takes a longer time to beat than anticipated, but not with Where Cards Fall. The game dragged on for much longer than it needed to, given that it wasn't actually weaving any sort of cohesive narrative, and the puzzles on their own weren't interesting enough. If you consider that every 10 seconds you're allowed to get another hint, this game can be rushed, actually bringing the playtime down. Despite that, it still dragged for me in the latter parts. There's no replay value either, as all the puzzles only have one solution. Sure, there may be slight tweaks to the sizes of the houses of cards necessary to progress, but in general, there's only one solution in terms of the layout you have to use for each puzzle. There's no secret path or alternate route to warrant a second playthrough. One of the extras, the ability to rewatch any cutscene from the menu, further takes away any replay value, as you can just watch all the cutscenes in any order if you feel you've missed something. I'm sure fans of puzzle games will find the length a good aspect of Where Cards Fall, and I can't totally punish a game for giving you too much content. But for me, this is a 2 out of 5. As you all know by now, post-game content is a must for me. Where Cards Fall falls flat in this regard, with no post-game. 0 out of 5. There are no collectibles to talk about either, which is a missed opportunity in a game where you're literally building platforms out of cards. 0 out of 5. Similarly to the collectibles, the developers could have easily added in challenges like a timed mode for the puzzles, or a mode in which you had to complete the puzzle in a certain amount of moves. Despite this being a puzzle game, I think the developers wanted to focus more on the story, and that's a shame seeing as how the game turned out. 0 out of 5. Finally, the extras. I wasn't expecting much, but this game actually delivered an adequate amount for what it is. As I've mentioned before, you can rewatch any cutscenes, which is nice if you also didn't like the game and had no idea what was going on in the story. You can also replay any level without resetting your story progress. You can also ask for hints from the main menu. All in all, it's not much, but it's enough for the minimalistic experience the game offers. 3 out of 5. Overall, this was one of the few games I actually hated reviewing. It's a pure puzzle game that tries to be some unique narrative experience when it's clearly not, instead of focusing on the puzzles and making the controls more consistent. The fact that it works as a puzzle game but fails in what the developers wanted it to be is also the reason that despite hating it, it deserved just a slightly below average 44 out of 100. Thanks for watching as always. Please hit that like button if you enjoyed this review more than I enjoyed this game. Peace!